If we can believe the results of assessments like the American College Test or the SAT, then it's very likely that subject-verb agreement might be the most problematic grammatical structure that we have to deal with in terms of not only test taking, but also writing and speaking. Now, what we're talking about with subject-verb agreement, obviously, is the agreement between the subject and the verb. And as simple as that sounds, think about the size of structures. If the sentence is 4 or 5 words and the subject is immediately preceding the verb, then we are very likely to have no problem whatsoever. However, as our sentences become larger, go from simple to compound to complex to compound complex, as our writing becomes more difficult and engages a variety of phrases and clauses in these structures, then the relationship between the subject and the verb becomes very, very dubious. And in fact, quite a few writers, in terms of their early writing experiences, do have a severe problem with the subject-verb relationship. Now, it is probably not a good plan to focus on subject-verb agreement while you're in the composition phase of any type of paper. The subject-verb agreement is a part of the editorial process after the paper is finished. You start taking the time to make sure that your subjects and your verbs are related. In general, subject-verb agreement becomes much more difficult in proportion to the number of things that you have between the subject and its verb. Now, obviously, we have sentences in which the subject comes after the verb, and that presents another slightly more different type of problem. But still, generally speaking, we put prepositional phrases, we put subordinate clauses, and other items between subjects and verbs, and the further we get the subject from the verb, the more likely it is that we're going to make an error in the subject-verb agreement. After that fact, after you could recognize that, in terms of a writer and an editor, the next thing is that subject-verb agreement also involves some subtle rules that the only way that you'd be able to deal with them in terms of your editorial skills would be to know those rules. And we do have them in the text. We have them numbered. We give illustrations of each one, and it takes time. And still, if we went through all of the grammar lessons and gave a cumulative assessment at the end, you would lose more points on subject-verb agreement and pronouns than everything else put together. Nothing changes that. So one hypothetical example is that if we take two subjects that are connected by and, let's say John and Mary, and then of course we add a verb. John and Mary are going to the fair. Well, John and Mary are, and are is plural. Now, you can have other subject combinations connected with something else, and one of those other subject-verb combinations might be connected with or nor. So if we said John or Mary, then that changes the relationship. We don't, just because we have two subjects, we don't automatically have a plural verb. As a matter of fact, when or nor connects two subjects, and entering freshmen in most colleges know this about 20% of the time. That means logically that 80% aren't aware of this in their initial experiences, at a post-secondary institution. John or Mary is. And that's one of those things that somebody says, well, that doesn't sound exactly right. Well, it's because we're used to an additive combination of subjects, usually at the beginning of a sentence, connected by or. It's much more common. But still, when or nor connect two subjects, the verb must agree with the closer of the two subjects. Now, that can be problematic because we can have the sergeant or his men are, or we could say his men or the sergeant is, because in both of those structures, the subject, the latter of the two in each case, must agree with the verb, and the verb changes. When men is the closer, it has to be are, the plural, to agree with men. When sergeant is the closest to the verb, the closer of the two, to be precise, then it would have to be the singular verb is. So again, that is just one of 4 or 5 examples of challenging structures that most students are not familiar with, that at the time they become acquainted with the challenges of subject-verb agreement, they have to review these things, they have to look at some examples, and then as they write and learn to edit correctly, they become more sensitive to the relationship between their subjects and verbs, and probably tend to do it a little bit better, tend to be able to correct a few of those things that are inevitable in composition, but which shouldn't survive good editing. So be aware, as you write and as you revise documents and groups of words for oral presentations or essays, that the relationship between the subject and the verb is one of the most critical and one of the most important reflections, of the status of your education at any point in time. Thank you.